Hello, and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and developments in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Shannon Tiezi, and I will be your moderator for our program today. Today on China Forum, we will be discussing a topic of truly global importance: China's environment and energy usage. China, currently the leading carbon dioxide emitter, will play a huge role in the global response to climate change. With me today to discuss these issues are two leading experts on China's environment and energy usage. I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Turner, the director of the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Over her 13 years at the center, she has created meetings, exchanges, and publications focusing on China's pollution and energy challenges, as well as green NGO activism and water issues. Her current major initiative, Choke Point China, has produced multimedia reports on the growing water energy confrontations in China, particularly the water footprint of coal. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Joanna Lewis, Assistant Professor of Science, Technology, and International Affairs at Georgetown University. Her research focuses on technology acquisition and innovation strategies, drawing from cases of renewable energy development in emerging economies. She is the author of Green Innovation in China, China's Wind Power Industry, and the Global Transition to a Low-Carbon Economy. Dr. Turner, Dr. Lewis, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Really happy to be here. Thanks
for having us. China's struggles with pollution gained international notoriety recently with the so-called airpocalypse in mid-January. For nearly 4 days, the pollution in Beijing remained at dangerously high levels. However, many China watchers were surprised and encouraged at the amount of media coverage of this event. Some hoped that the tone of official news reports might signal a change in the government's commitment to the environment. We also saw that Beijing's air pollution control regulations promised to fine the polluters who are creating smog in China's capital. Do you think that these signals indicate that the new leadership in China is willing to take concrete steps to cut back on pollution? We'll start with you, Joanna.
Sure. Well, I think that, the new leadership probably didn't expect that one of the first challenges they were going to be facing was this horrible pollution, which we've all heard has been enveloping not just Beijing but much of eastern China. China has this challenging situation where the eastern coast holds, the majority of their population, the majority of their economic output also is generated in the eastern coastal area. And Beijing, the capital city, is really in the middle of a rust belt, a heavy industrial belt where many of China's manufacturing goods are produced. And so, with the weather situation, Beijing has just been really suffering from pollution rates that we just haven't seen in a very long time. But I think that there have been some really positive signals coming from recent announcements, including the new 12th five-year energy plan, which has looked at how to not just control the pollutants coming out of motor vehicles and industrial sources, but also to try to curb coal use in the entire country.
But if I can add that because I've been hanging out watching China environment for a long time, the openness in the news media to environment has been developing since the late 1990s when the State Council, top-down order. Every year, journalists will cover environmental issues. This year, water, right? But so you've been having this growing cohort of journalists who are specializing in environment, but also other, besides the print, we have these freelance journalists, the NGO communities in China also doing some of their own stories and reporting, and Open Information Act by the government back in 2008, and on the same day of this, basically a kind of Freedom of Information Act in China, and the Ministry of Environmental Protection on the same day in 2008, I think it was May 1st, passed that environmental open information measures. And so the idea that information on environment should be more open, the public has a right to know, and I think that also has kind of galvanized the news media to open up even more. So it's been a long time coming. And protests have been growing over the years on pollution too, which I think has also pushed this opening.
Right. I think when most people think about China's pollution issues, air pollution is the one that comes immediately to mind, especially here in the West, looking towards China. But they've also had a lot of issues with with water, and I know this is your area of expertise, Dr. Turner. And those protests that you mentioned, a lot of the recent ones that I can think of have been water issues. People don't want local factories polluting their water sources. So could you tell us a little more about how water issues are playing into the whole environmental picture in China?
Yeah, I mean, again, you said it exactly right, that air pollution, it's in your face and you notice it more. But I really think that, you know, not to underplay all my friends who work on energy, that that water is probably their bigger challenge. I mean, somewhere around 30% of their water is of a quality, you know, their standards 4, 5, and 5+, which means it really shouldn't be used for any use. And we know it's being used. In part of our Choke Point China reports, most recent report had tried to go a little bit more in depth into how industrial wastewater is increasingly being used to irrigate fields because that's all there is. And so, you know, so the impacts on the economy and people's health, I mean, it's hard. You know, you get these numbers from the World Bank that you know how much it's overall just pollution is costing the economy. But I mean, but water, it's starting to, you know, some companies are actually thinking of, you know, leaving China because the water quality is so poor, and so it's a major challenge.
And water is very connected to energy as well.
And water is connected to energy. I mean, something in our Choke Point China work that besides, you know, people think of coal, for example, just using water, but coal also pollutes. And when we did our research working with Chinese, you know, government and think tank folks on how much water the coal sector is using, we estimate about 20% of the country's water is being used by coal. Not all of it's consumptive, but it has to be there for the coal to use. And then there's the issue of coal ash and the pollution from, I mean, the air emissions coming to the ground. I mean, it's huge, but it's a cost of coal that the Chinese haven't really ever calculated before. That said, just yesterday, I got the news that in China's 12th five-year plan, they have a coal subsector plan, and they mention water for the first time. And I know you're thinking I'm silly because I'm very excited, but I'm excited because it's showing a new prioritization on how coal is impacting water. Because water resources are already very polluted, it's very scarce. Northern China, what the coal is very dry. And it's a train wreck happening. Oh, and then layer on top of that the impacts of climate change, right? The water resources even getting less in southern China. So I think water is something that actually, I mean, I'm optimistic because I'm just built that way, but water could be an issue that could kind of help actually work on the coal issue.
Right. Well, and now that China is starting to recognize the full cost that coal has, both on its air and on its water, they've been moving towards cleaner energy sources, which I know Dr. Lewis has done a lot of research on. Can you tell us a little bit about what sectors of clean energy China is most focusing its energy on and what effect that's having on their total energy picture?
Sure. Well, the majority of China's electricity use still comes from coal, followed by hydropower. But the third largest source of electricity in China is now actually wind energy. Wind is actually generating more electricity than even nuclear energy, although the country has plans to scale both up substantially. And solar energy is really the new area of clean energy development in China, with very ambitious targets going forward, which actually keep getting elevated. China has plans to install more solar in the next 5 years than the rest of the world combined, really. So
they already do it on coal so much.
Right, of course. I mean, China, of course, does everything at scale and can, and wind has really been, you know, one technology that I focus a lot on in my work because it was really one of the first new renewable energy technologies that they were able to deploy at scale. China is the largest wind energy user in the world, as well as now one of the largest manufacturers of wind energy technology.
And I know both of you have mentioned at different points China's 5-year plan and its energy targets. And I wonder if each of you could just tell me what you see as the most ambitious or the most meaningful going forward targets that they've set and how realistic you think that these targets are. And we'll start with you,
I was going to start with the energy. Start with energy first. I'm better on the water piece of it.
Any targets.
Any targets. So I think that what again, being excited, I mean that because it does have an energy footprint, they require now that industries improve, that they start recycling at least 30% of their water. And you have to keep in mind that, you know, when industry becomes more water efficient, that also lowers the energy footprint. Because China, we don't know how much energy they use to actually move water or pump water. We figure it's a lot. I mean, the US uses about 20% of our energy just to move and clean water. And so having this kind of recycling efficiencies are important for China. I mean, you say, China does everything to scale everything big, and my line is China also has to be more efficient than anyone else. My apologies, the US is also very wasteful, but China has absolutely no wiggle room in terms of natural resources, both on water and coal. But how coal's been developed to date, where it's all water short, their South-North Water Transfer Project, transfer water in, so very energy intensive water to try to get at the energy. So that was really encouraging. And as I mentioned before, the thought that while there were no targets associated with it, the fact that the coal water issue was mentioned is a signal, I think, that targets are to come. So that's how it often evolves, even with the renewable energy regulations of days gone by, right?
Yeah, I think, and to build on that, a couple other targets that are particularly meaningful are the energy intensity targets and the carbon intensity targets. So the 12th five-year plan builds on energy intensity targets that were promulgated in the 11th five-year plan. They're slightly less ambitious in terms of the overall reduction, but actually, since a lot of the so-called low-hanging fruit was likely already captured through energy efficiency improvements in the 11th five-year plan period, which ran through 2010, it may be much more challenging for them to actually meet the energy intensity target going forward through 2015. And the 12th five-year plan is the first target we've seen, the first time we've actually seen a carbon intensity target. China uses intensity index targets frequently. This is carbon divided by economic output, essentially, because this is a way for them to actually index carbon emissions to economic growth. So it's not an absolute target. China's carbon dioxide emissions are still growing exponentially. But by putting in place these intensity targets, it actually requires, all the way down to the firm level, for companies to start taking inventories of not just their energy consumption, which they've been doing for a while, but also their carbon dioxide emissions, and to monitor and report these emissions. And this is going to be very important for a variety of policies that China is currently putting in place to regulate carbon dioxide emissions, including several cap-and-trade programs.
Actually, I should note, I've just remembered too, that the PM 2.5 also came up in, again, we just heard about this yesterday. It's still all just in Chinese, but in the coal subsector plan that is saying that coal facilities, energy facilities, they say energy, they mean coal, has to reduce PM 2.5 by 30%, which is very ambitious. I haven't even had a chance to ask colleagues in China, how realistic is that? But that's very significant. Wouldn't you say that compared to today, where it hasn't been regulated really until recently.
Well, they weren't even collecting and reporting the data until recently, so I think that's meaningful, at least that now they feel like they can start to regulate.
Now, when it comes to these regulation and monitoring and reporting efforts, I know there have been criticisms in the past that China's Environmental Protection Ministry does not really have the political backing and the teeth, quote unquote, to truly enforce these regulations, especially when we get down to the local level. So how do you view this problem, and is there a way that maybe NGOs or local populations or even international pressure could help enforce these standards if the ministry is not able to do so?
Well, just to clarify, some of the policies we're talking about are under the purview of Ministry of Environmental Protection, and some aren't. So a lot of the energy and climate change related policies are actually regulated by NDRC, the National Development Reform Commission. They control the broader energy pricing policies as well as planning for supply and demand. But perhaps you could address MEP specifically.
Yeah, but for the PM 2.5, that is MEP's purview, and I think they were. I fancy they were probably really, I don't want to say really happy that now that they could actually regulate, because for many years they wanted to have kind of a co-control policy, kind of linking CO2 and traditional pollutants, and try to, instead of just regulating one by one, pull it all together. And they haven't really had a lot of power, particularly vis-a-vis the energy sector, which is quite powerful. But now they have, again, the public behind them, the news media behind them, and we have to kind of wait and see. Because again, they don't, Ministry of Environmental Protection is still not very well funded, not a big agency, and when you get lower down the food chain, local environmental protection bureaus, their boss is also the local government, which still would prioritize economic development. That said, when you look at a trend, I think definitely over the last 5-6 years, in the east coast of China, which is more developed, the public, even city people, go out to the streets and protest. And they're starting to say, you know, look, we really do want it cleaner. So cities along the east coast are sometimes pushing some of these dirty industries further inland, where, you know, they have little economic development opportunities. And so we've seen this kind of migration of the pollution, you know, inland. And I think that makes it a lot tougher, because along the coast, I mean, you have in the big cities a lot of the international NGOs who've worked with policymakers and city governments on enforcement, but it gets more difficult when you start just dispersing them out into Western China, which is, you know, it's a bigger realm to try to control it.
And I think that we see some real differences at the local level, or the level of implementation, when it comes to the technical challenges associated with enforcing these policies. So, for example, a lot of the energy efficiency policies, the power plant owners, the factory owners can see real advantages to their bottom line if they can figure out a way to produce the same amount of whatever the product is they're producing with less energy. That's less energy they're purchasing, right? But when you're looking at something like controlling sulfur dioxide emissions on a coal-fired power plant, you are actually using more electricity from the plant to scrub the sulfur dioxide. So you're actually seeing a net loss potentially, you know, a loss in electricity you can then sell as a power plant owner. So I think, you know, you see these different incentives being carried out at the local level, which has some implications for how these regulations get enforced.
And coal, I mean, the coal-fired power plants, it's a different animal than when we think of like the green supply chain, for example, clothes in China. Natural Resources Defense Council is working with, I think it's Greenpeace and others, on it's called Clean by Design. They're working with textile manufacturers, the ones that dye the clothing. These small and medium enterprises, which is the main source of a lot of the water pollution, but probably a lot of energy wastage as well. And they're trying to help them learn about best practices for low-cost, no-cost ways of becoming more efficient in terms of water use and water pollution. And that's an excellent model for the industrial sector, I think, for, you know, and thinking that, I mean, again, that's not getting to the coal, but in some ways, you know, we can't forget that who's using a lot of the energy? It's the industrial sector. And so the more efficient that they can become, the better. What's notable is that in this initiative, you've got the Target and H&M and Levi and all these big, you know, companies in the West are kind of helping to support it, because it's you know, trying to green the supply chain. I mean, that's an important piece, because I think I tend to shy away that the international community cannot force China to do anything. And I think that kind of, you know, thinking about environmental issues, that there's been so much really positive, often quiet engagement for a long time of international NGOs, the US national labs, who, you know, you've hung out with them for a long time too, helping China set energy efficiency standards. And it's, you know, there's been a lot of work done over, gosh, last 20, 30 years that it doesn't make the headlines, but you know, without their work, I think we would have had this apocalypse even sooner.
And that really brings us to the next major point, which is that China's pollution problems really are part of a larger global crisis that we're having with climate change. And it's going to take a concerted international effort to really change that on a global scale. So how does China view its own pollution problems within the larger global community? And how is it working to change this? Is it because it's a domestic problem and it wants to solve it as a domestic problem first? Or is China also taking into account the broader international problem and maybe the pressure being put on it in international negotiations?
Well, I think we've seen a real sea change in China's approach to climate change over the last 5 to 10 years. And I think where you've really seen a lot of action is at the domestic level within China. I already mentioned the carbon intensity targets and some of the domestic policies going forward. But they're really, you know, I think taking this very seriously. You never hear scientists questioning the validity of climate change, whether it's happening. This is something that, because of the security issues related to water, related to food, agriculture production, this is something that I think is a real concern. The fact that so many of Chinese cities are in low-lying coastal areas, much of Shanghai is either at or below sea level. And so I think that this is a serious problem and is being addressed through a variety of policy measures. There are multiple pilot cap-and-trade programs, for example, for trading carbon dioxide emissions being implemented right now in China with an eye towards potentially implementing a national program by 2015, which would be quite aggressive. And I mentioned these national carbon intensity targets going forward. These are targets that were announced leading up to the international negotiations in Copenhagen. So I think there is some relationship between what happens in the international climate negotiations and what happens domestically in China. But that said, I think a lot of what is driving the policy actions China is taking are these domestic concerns rather than international concerns. But China has, I think, been playing a more and more constructive role in the international negotiations as well. And I think that right now, the U.S. has had a hard time playing the leadership role that many thought it would play when the Obama administration was elected. And I think this is going to be a really interesting time to see what ends up happening in the next 4 years in the United States and the role that the climate policy, the importance that the administration places on climate policy in the second term.
Mm-hmm. I think that in terms of pollution, I mean, water is a very local issue, and air pollution wafts about, right? I mean, but I think that, I mean, internationally, I mean, China, what I've been struck with, I mean, that's why I have such fun in my job, is that China has given a lot of political space for international organizations, multilateral, bilateral, NGOs, universities. I work with Vermont Law School that is working with Chinese lawyers and judges to try to improve the governance issues, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just about the Ministry of Environmental Protection, it's also the legal sphere. China opened their first public interest law firm, and there's international organizations that are involved in that kind of capacity building. So I think that's also a very encouraging sign to me, that they realize that, I mean, I think first and foremost it is because of the local problem, but it can't be good, thinking about, the China Inc., marketing China, the fact that people are choking, that's not good for international investment on which, China very much depends, and also their own stability. Mm-hmm. I mean, even the government officials themselves, I mean, they're all breathing it in.
Could you go into a little more detail about how China and the U.S. specifically are working together? I know outside of climate change negotiations on a global scale, the U.S. and China have incorporated climate environmental protection issues into their own bilateral dialogues. So what steps are being taken, and what steps would you like to see taken in an ideal world?
You want to start with the one, two,
yeah, maybe I could start with the energy side. I mean, China and the U.S. have, about 30 plus years, I think, of cooperation on
40. It's 40.
Almost 40 now.
Almost
yes.
40
now. Yeah, you're right. Going back to I believe 78. And this is cooperation broadly on science and technology issues, but energy has been a very important piece of this for a long time. And in 2009, President Obama and President Hu signed a new set of bilateral agreements focusing specifically on clean energy in a variety of sectors, cooperation that focused specifically on advanced coal technologies, vehicle technologies, energy efficiency, renewable energy, along with a few other topics. And I think one of the most interesting programs which has come from this is the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. This is I think a really new model of cooperation between China and the United States, in that it aims not just to hold policy dialogues or scientific and technical exchanges, but to really collaborate on research, development, demonstration of a variety of clean energy technologies, focusing on coal buildings and vehicles. So I think this is going to be an interesting one to watch going forward.
In terms of the U.S. EPA also has long worked with China. The Air Office probably most successfully, even though it is striking that they don't really have a budget for it. They pick up nickels on the sidewalk. Has long been my line. But you have this really dedicated staff that they work with their Chinese colleagues on regional air issues, which seems incredibly relevant today, right? and trying to help China. I remember a study back in the 90s for Shanghai looking at energy options and health benefits. There'd never been a study like this before, rolling it out to policymakers about how, well, the choices you make, Shanghai, on whether you're using coal or starting leaning towards renewables, this is what it'll cost you in terms of health benefits. And I mean, this was a while back, but Shanghai changed their 10th five-year plan. And so the U.S. government has a unique role often to work with their Chinese colleagues. The Chinese are very interested in our Clean Water Act and those kind of models, but it's a lot harder for our EPA water folks to work in China. That said, the Trade Development Agency, they also work to do some trainings and demonstrations in China that, trying to promote some business-to-business cooperation around environmental clean energy technologies, environmental technologies. And so there's a lot going on, but there's not, I think that the challenge is that, on the energy front, it seems like it got a big boost in 2009 with those clean energy agreements, but it's not like it's a priority. Congress doesn't really, there's no funding for it. So I think that's, it's a missed opportunity, because I feel like that the U.S. and China, as we have sometimes some difficulties with each other, and I personally feel that having some areas of goodwill between the two countries and environment and clean energy makes a lot of sense. In cooperating, we're competitors in some things, but there's cooperative possibilities.
And I think while it's really important, there's all these different tracks of cooperation happening. I think something that's fallen a bit by the wayside is high-level strategic coordination between the two countries. I think this is too important a topic for it to just be sort of delegated, down to lower levels of government. I think this is something that needs to be, put back into, whether it's the strategic and economic dialogues between our two countries, or other high-level discussions between the leadership. But I would like to see going forward that energy and climate again be addressed at a much higher level in the U.S.-China bilateral relationship.
Back when Vice President Al Gore, with his then counterpart Li Peng, they'd started this U.S.-China Environment and Development Forum, which was the first time really high-level interagency dialogue, and it really was about climate change. But because I've been here long enough, 13 years, I've seen these kind of, well, you too, these ups and downs of the relationship. But it was also really, even though it didn't lead to any increase in money on the U.S. side, the agencies themselves in the U.S. felt more willing to do this cooperation, because they were getting leadership from above, and I think it would be nice to see, and maybe we will see it.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you both so much for an engaging discussion, and I know that we will all be watching these climate change negotiations as they continue throughout the next couple of years to see what role China plays, what role the U.S. plays, and how the global community can come together to fight these issues. So Dr. Turner, Dr. Lewis, thank you for joining us, and thank you for tuning in, and we will see you next time on China Forum.